Number 1. Wade Wilson. She answered the door that morning thinking it was just another day. But for Christine Melton, October 7th, 2019 would be her last. The man standing on her doorstep in Cape Coral, Florida, didn't look like a monster. He had tattoos, sure, but so did half the people in town. What she didn't know was that Wade Wilson, who'd later become known across the internet as the Deadpool Killer because of his name and face tattoos, was about to shatter the lives of 2 families in less than 24 hours. Wade Wilson wasn't born a killer. He grew up in Florida, had relationships, held jobs, and by most accounts lived a relatively unremarkable life for years. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. Friends and family would later describe him as charming when he wanted to be, but volatile. He had a history of drug use, run-ins with the law, and relationships that ended badly. By 2019, Wilson was drifting. No steady work, no real direction. He was staying, with people here and there, moving between couches and cheap motels. Cape Coral, a quiet southwestern Florida city known for its canals and retirees, seemed like an unlikely stage for what was about to happen. October 7th started like any other Monday. Christine Melton, a 35-year-old woman who worked hard and kept to herself, was at home. Somehow Wilson ended up at her door. The exact details of how they met remain unclear. Some reports suggest they'd crossed paths the night before, possibly at a bar. What is clear is that Wilson gained entry to her home, and once inside, he attacked her. Christine was strangled to death in her own bedroom. Wilson didn't panic. He didn't flee immediately. Instead, he stole her car, a beige Nissan, and drove away as if nothing had happened. But he wasn't done. Just hours later, Diane Ruiz, a 43-year-old woman, was walking along a Cape Coral street. She was on her way to meet someone, living her life, completely unaware that Wade Wilson was about to cross her path. He spotted her from the stolen car, pulled over, and somehow convinced her to get in. What happened next is almost too horrific to process. Wilson drove Diane to a remote area, attacked her, and then ran her over with the car, repeatedly. Her body was found days later in a field behind a Sam's Club. The brutality was staggering. Investigators would later say she'd been run over so many times that identifying her took significant effort. Imagine being a detective walking into that scene. Imagine trying to piece together how someone could do that to another human being, not once, but twice in a single day. The discovery came quickly. Christine's body was found in her home when concerned friends checked on her after she didn't show up for work. The stolen car was the first major clue. Surveillance footage from around Cape Coral showed the beige Nissan in various locations throughout the day on October 7th. Traffic cameras captured the vehicle. Witnesses came forward. One person reported seeing a man matching Wilson's description, acting strangely near where Diane's body was eventually found. The pieces started coming together fast. Wilson was arrested on October 8th, just one day after the crimes. He was pulled over while driving Christine's car, and when police ran the plates, everything clicked. He was taken into custody without incident, but the investigation was just beginning. Detectives had to connect him definitively to both women. They gathered phone records, surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and witness statements. The case against him grew stronger by the day. Wilson's own behavior didn't help his defense. He made statements to people in jail, and some of those conversations were recorded. In some of them, he reportedly showed no remorse. In fact, he seemed almost proud. The trial took years to reach. Wade Wilson was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges including grand theft auto, battery, and burglary. His defense team faced an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who killed without reason, without mercy, and without hesitation. They presented the timeline, the forensic evidence, the stolen car, the surveillance footage. They brought in witnesses who testified about Wilson's behavior before and after the crimes. The defense tried to argue mitigating factors: his drug use, his troubled past, his mental state, but none of it could explain away what he'd done. In June 2024, after deliberation, the jury found Wade Wilson guilty on all counts. The courtroom was packed. Families of both victims were present, and when the verdict was read, there were tears of relief, of grief, of exhaustion. But the trial wasn't over yet. Florida is a death penalty state, and the prosecution was seeking the ultimate punishment. The penalty phase began, and both sides presented arguments about whether Wilson should live or die. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed. Wade Wilson was formally sentenced to death in August 2024. He currently sits on death row in Florida, awaiting the appeals process that will likely take years, if not decades. His case sparked widespread attention, partly because of his name and his facial tattoos, which gave him an eerie resemblance to the fictional character Deadpool. Online, people debated whether he'd chosen the tattoos to mimic the character or if it was just a coincidence. But for the families of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz, none of that mattered. 2 women were gone. 2 lives were stolen in a single day by someone who felt nothing. And here's the question that lingers. What makes someone capable of that? Wade Wilson had a past, sure, but nothing that screamed future killer. He wasn't raised in extreme violence. He wasn't abused as a child in any documented way. He just snapped. Or maybe he didn't snap at all. Maybe he just decided one day in October that other people's lives didn't matter. And that's the most terrifying part. Because if it could happen to him, if someone so seemingly ordinary could do something so monstrous, then how do we ever really know who's capable of what? Number 2, Derek Chauvin. The camera was rolling. That's what changed everything. On May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a 17-year-old girl named Darnella Frazier pulled out her phone and started recording. What she captured over the next 9 minutes and 29 seconds would spark protests across the globe, reignite conversations about policing and race, and ultimately send a police officer to prison for murder. Derek Chauvin, a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department, knelt on George Floyd's neck for nearly 10 minutes while Floyd pleaded for his life, called out for his mother, and eventually stopped breathing. The world watched, and this time, there was no looking away. Derek Chauvin wasn't a rookie cop who panicked in the heat of the moment. He was 44 years old, with nearly 2 decades of experience on the force. He'd worked thousands of shifts, made countless arrests, and by all official accounts, knew exactly what he was doing when he put on that uniform every day. Chauvin had been involved in several controversial incidents over his career. Complaints had been filed, use of force reports had been written, but he'd always walked away clean. The system had protected him, as it had protected so many officers before him. He was married, lived in the suburbs, and on paper looked like a standard career cop. But on May 25th, 2020, something shifted. Whether it was indifference, anger, or something darker, Derek Chauvin made a choice that would define the rest of his life. George Floyd had been accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store called Cup Foods in South Minneapolis. The store clerk called the police, and officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Quang arrived first. They approached Floyd, who was sitting in his car with 2 other people. The interaction started calmly enough, but it escalated quickly. Floyd was visibly distressed, and the officers struggled to get him into the back of their squad car. He told them he was claustrophobic, that he couldn't breathe, that he was scared. The officers didn't listen. They called for backup. Derek Chauvin and Officer Tu Thao arrived as backup. By the time they got there, Floyd was on the ground, handcuffed, face down on the pavement. And that's when Chauvin made his move. He placed his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck and pressed down. Floyd was already restrained. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't resisting. But Chauvin kept his knee there for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Floyd begged. He said, "I can't breathe," more than 20 times. He called out for his mother, who had passed away years earlier. Bystanders pleaded with Chauvin to stop, to check Floyd's pulse, to show some humanity. An off-duty firefighter, trained in emergency medical response, begged to be allowed to help. Chauvin refused. He kept his knee on Floyd's neck, even after Floyd stopped moving, stopped speaking, stopped breathing. Imagine standing there, watching this happen, knowing something was terribly wrong, but being powerless to stop it because the person causing the harm was wearing a badge. Paramedics arrived and found George Floyd unresponsive. He was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The official cause of death, determined later by the medical examiner, was cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. In simpler terms, George Floyd died because Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck until his heart and lungs stopped working. The video spread like wildfire. Darnella Fraser's footage, along with other recordings from bystanders and surveillance cameras, was shared millions of times within hours. People watched George Floyd die in real time, and the reaction was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted in Minneapolis that very night. Within days, demonstrations had spread across the United States and around the world. People marched in London, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, all demanding justice for George Floyd and accountability for Derek Chauvin. The investigation moved quickly, partly because the evidence was so overwhelming. The videos left no room for ambiguity. The Minneapolis Police Department fired all 4 officers involved, Chauvin, Lane, Quang, and Thao, within 24 hours. But firing wasn't enough. The public demanded arrests. On May 29, 2020, 4 days after George Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The charges would later be upgraded to include second-degree murder as prosecutors built their case. The trial began in March 2021 at the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis. The world was watching. The prosecution's case was devastating in its clarity. They played the videos, all of them, showing Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck from multiple angles. They brought in medical experts who testified that Floyd died from lack of oxygen, that the restraint Chauvin used was not consistent with police training, that it was excessive and deadly. They called witnesses who'd been there that day, including Darnella Fraser, who described the trauma of watching a man die and being unable to help. The defense tried to argue that Floyd's pre-existing health conditions and drug use were the real cause of death, that Chauvin had been following his training, that the situation was chaotic and required force. They brought in their own medical experts who tried to muddy the waters, suggesting Floyd might have died from a heart condition or an overdose. But the prosecution dismantled those arguments methodically. They showed that even Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arredondo testified against Chauvin, stating that the restraint violated department policy. They demonstrated that Chauvin had continued to kneel on Floyd even after he was unresponsive, even after there was no pulse. The jury deliberated for about 10 hours over 2 days. On April 20th, 2021, they returned their verdict, guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. The courtroom was silent. Outside, crowds who'd been holding their breath erupted in celebration and tears. For once, the system had worked. An officer had been held accountable. Sentencing came 2 months later, in June 2021. The prosecution asked for 30 years. The defense asked for probation, claiming Chauvin had already suffered enough. The judge, Peter Cahill, sentenced Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison, longer than the standard guidelines, but shorter than what many had hoped for. George Floyd's family gave victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears, describing the man he'd been, the father and brother and son they'd lost, the hole his death had left in their lives. Derek Chauvin is currently serving his sentence in a federal prison in Arizona, transferred from Minnesota for his own safety. He was also convicted in federal court on civil rights charges in 2021 and received a concurrent 21-year sentence. He's appealed his conviction, as most do, but so far, those appeals have been denied. The 3 other officers involved, Lane, Queng, and Thao, were also convicted on federal civil rights charges and received sentences ranging from 2.5 to 3.5 years. Here's what haunts people about this case. It almost didn't matter. Without that video, without Darnella Fraser's bravery in pulling out her phone and recording, Derek Chauvin might have walked away. The initial police report described the incident as a medical incident following an arrest. There was no mention of a knee on a neck, no acknowledgement of the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of sustained force. If not for that footage, George Floyd would have been just another name in a long list of people who died in police custody, forgotten by everyone except his family. And that's the question that lingers. How many times has this happened when the cameras weren't rolling? Number 3, Darren Pensel. The train from Guildford to London Waterloo was packed that Friday afternoon, January 4th, 2019. Commuters heading home after work, families out for the day, people living their normal lives in those cramped carriages. Lee Pomeroy was one of them, a 51-year-old IT consultant, a father, a husband. He was traveling with his 14-year-old son, just trying to get from one place to another. In about 30 minutes, he'd be dead on that train. And the man who killed him, he'd been looking for a fight all day. Darren Pensel wasn't a stranger to violence. The 36-year-old had a criminal record stretching back years. Assault, drug offenses, the kind of background that painted a picture of someone with a short fuse and a long history of bad decisions. He'd spent time in prison before. He had paranoid schizophrenia, though whether he was taking his medication at the time remains a point of contention. On January 4th, he was traveling on that same train with his girlfriend, Chelsea Mitchell. According to witnesses, he'd been agitated all day, muttering to himself, pacing, looking for confrontation. The train was crowded, people were shoulder to shoulder, and tensions were already high in that uniquely British way where everyone's annoyed but nobody says anything, until something happened. The details of how the confrontation started are still somewhat disputed, but what's clear is this. Darren Pensel and Lee Pomeroy got into an argument. Some reports suggest it started over something minor, a bump, a look, the kind of thing that happens 100 times a day on crowded public transport and usually goes nowhere. But Pensel wasn't looking to let it go. Witnesses later described him as aggressive from the start, escalating immediately. Lee, by all accounts, tried to defuse the situation. He wasn't a fighter. He was just a dad trying to protect his son and get through the day. But Pensel wasn't interested in de-escalation. Within moments, the argument turned physical, and then Pensel pulled out a knife. What happened next unfolded in front of dozens of horrified passengers, including Lee's teenage son. Pensel attacked Lee with a ferocity that left everyone in that carriage frozen in terror. He stabbed him, not once, not twice, 18 times. 18. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic, frantic, and utterly senseless. Lee tried to defend himself, tried to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The train was moving. The carriage was packed. People were screaming, scrambling to get away, pulling out phones to call for help. Lee's son watched his father being attacked and could do nothing to stop it. Imagine being on that train. Imagine the sounds, the panic, the helplessness. Lee collapsed. Pensil, covered in blood, fled through the train carriages as it pulled into the next station, Horsley, a small suburban stop in Surrey. He jumped off and ran, leaving Lee bleeding out on the floor of the train. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Lee Pomeroy was pronounced dead at the scene. His son, traumatized beyond measure, had just witnessed his father's life end in the most violent way imaginable. The manhunt began immediately. British Transport Police released CCTV images of Pensil within hours. The footage was chilling. It showed him calmly walking through the train before the attack, then fleeing afterward, blood visible on his clothing. The images were plastered across news outlets and social media. Tips started flooding in. Pensil had gone on the run with Chelsea Mitchell, and police launched a coordinated effort to track them down. They weren't hard to find. The next morning, less than 24 hours after the attack, armed officers arrested both of them at an address in Farnham, Surrey. Pensil didn't resist. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses came forward, dozens of them. The train had been full, and almost everyone in that carriage had seen at least part of what happened. CCTV footage from inside the train captured the entire attack. There was no ambiguity, no question of what had occurred. The knife was recovered. Forensic evidence tied Pensil directly to the scene. His girlfriend, Chelsea Mitchell, became a key figure in the investigation as well. Prosecutors would later argue that she'd helped him flee, that she'd assisted him in evading capture, and that she'd known exactly what he'd done. Darren Pensil was charged with murder. Chelsea Mitchell was charged with assisting an offender. The trial began in June 2019 at the Old Bailey, one of the UK's most famous criminal courts. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the CCTV footage, the witness testimony, the forensic evidence. They showed the jury exactly what Pensil had done and left no room for doubt. The defense tried to argue that Pensil's mental health issues, his paranoid schizophrenia, should be taken into account, that he hadn't been in control of his actions, that this was a case of diminished responsibility rather than outright murder. The jury didn't buy it. Experts testified that while Pensil did have mental health issues, he was aware of what he was doing. He'd armed himself with a knife before getting on that train. He'd escalated a minor argument into a deadly confrontation. He'd stabbed Lee Pomeroy 18 times and then fled, which showed awareness and intent. The defense's argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. After deliberating, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Darren Pensil was convicted of murder. Chelsea Mitchell was found guilty of assisting an offender. The sentencing came in July 2019. Lee Pomeroy's family gave victim impact statements that left the courtroom in silence. His wife described the unbearable pain of losing her husband, of watching their son struggle with the trauma of what he'd witnessed. Lee's son, now fatherless, spoke about how that day had destroyed his sense of safety, his ability to trust the world. The judge listened, then turned to Pensil. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 28 years before he'd even be eligible for parole. At 36 years old, that meant Pensil wouldn't see freedom until he was at least 64, if ever. Chelsea Mitchell received a sentence of over 2 years for helping him escape. Pensil is currently serving his sentence in a UK prison. There's no parole in sight, no early release, no redemption arc. He remains behind bars, and the Pomeroy family remains shattered. Here's what haunts people about this case. It was so random. Lee Pomeroy wasn't targeted. He didn't know Darren Pencil. He wasn't involved in anything dangerous. He was just on a train with his son, and he had the misfortune of crossing paths with someone who was looking for violence. It could have been anyone. That's the part that keeps people up at night. You get on a train, you mind your own business, and in 30 minutes, your life is over because someone decided you looked at them wrong, and his son had to watch it happen. Number 4. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell. They called themselves the Vibrant Couple. Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, deeply religious, obsessed with the end times, convinced they were chosen for something greater. They posted smiling photos on social media, attended religious conferences, and spoke about visions and revelations. To the outside world, they looked like devout believers who'd found each other later in life. But behind the scenes, something far darker was unfolding. By the time authorities caught up with them, 4 people would be dead, including 2 innocent children who'd been buried in Chad Daybell's backyard like they were nothing. Lori Vallow wasn't always this way. Born Lori Noreen Cox in 1973, she grew up in California, married young, and seemed to live a relatively normal life for years. She had children, went through divorces, remarried. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother to her kids, Tylee Ryan, born in 2002, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, adopted in 2014. Friends and family described her as loving, energetic, someone who lit up a room. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Lori became involved with fringe religious beliefs, extreme interpretations of Mormon doctrine mixed with apocalyptic predictions and talk of dark spirits and zombies. Not the Hollywood kind. The kind she believed possessed people's bodies, making them no longer human. Enter Chad Daybell. A self-published author of apocalyptic fiction, Chad had built a small following in certain religious circles. He claimed to have visions, to communicate with the other side, to know when the end of the world was coming. He was married to Tammy Daybell, his wife of nearly 30 years, and they had 5 children together. But when Chad met Lori at a religious conference in 2018, something shifted. They became inseparable. They believed they'd been married in past lives, that they were destined to be together, that they had a mission to prepare for the end times. There was just one problem. They were both married to other people, and those people started dying. Charles Vallow, Lori's 4th husband and JJ's adoptive father, was the first to raise alarms. By early 2019, he was terrified. He told friends and family that Lori had changed, that she believed she was a god, that she'd threatened to kill him. He filed for divorce and tried to get custody of JJ, claiming Lori was mentally unstable. He begged people to listen. On July 11th, 2019, Charles was shot and killed in Chandler, Arizona. The shooter? Lori's brother, Alex Cox, who claimed it was self-defense. Charles had come to pick up JJ. An argument broke out, and Alex said he had no choice. Police investigated, but no charges were filed immediately. Charles was gone, and Lori inherited his life insurance policy. Less than 2 months later, Tylee Ryan was last seen on September 8, 2019. The 17-year-old was at Yellowstone National Park with Lori, JJ, and Alex Cox. There's a photo from that day. Tylee smiling, unaware it would be the last time anyone outside the family saw her alive. After that trip, she vanished. Friends asked where she was. Family called. Lori had excuses. Tylee was at college. She was with friends. She was busy. But nobody could reach her. Nobody could confirm she was okay. JJ disappeared shortly after. The last confirmed sighting of the 7-year-old boy was in late September 2019. He was autistic, full of energy, loved by everyone who knew him. His grandparents, Charles's parents, tried desperately to check on him. Lori blocked them. Schools were contacted, Welfare checks were requested, but Lori and the kids had moved. In November 2019, police in Idaho conducted a welfare check after JJ's grandparents reported him missing. Lori and Chad, who had quietly married in Hawaii just weeks after Chad's wife Tammy died suddenly in her sleep in October, claimed JJ was with relatives. But when police returned the next day to follow up, Lori and Chad were gone. They'd fled to Hawaii. Imagine being those grandparents. Imagine knowing something was horribly wrong and being powerless to stop it. The investigation exploded into national news. Where were Tylee and JJ? Lori was located in Hawaii in January 2020 and ordered to produce the children within 5 days. She didn't. She couldn't. In February, she was arrested and extradited back to Idaho. She refused to cooperate, maintained the kids were safe, and hired lawyers who argued she was being persecuted for her religious beliefs. But investigators weren't buying it. They started digging, literally. On June 9, 2020, law enforcement executed a search warrant on Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg, Idaho. What they found was unspeakable. Buried in the backyard, concealed in shallow graves, were the remains of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. Tylee's body had been dismembered and burned. JJ had been wrapped in plastic and duct tape. The children had been dead for months, likely since shortly after they were last seen in September 2019. Chad Daybell was arrested at the scene. The charges: conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, and concealing evidence. But the deaths didn't stop there. Investigators took another look at Tammy Daybell's sudden death in October 2019. She'd been buried quickly, no autopsy performed. Her body was exhumed, and the medical examiner's findings were damning. Tammy had been asphyxiated. She didn't die peacefully in her sleep. She was murdered. Chad and Lori were both charged with her death as well. And then there was Charles Vallow's shooting. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, who'd killed Charles, died suddenly in December 2019, just months after the shooting. Officially, it was a blood clot. But investigators suspected foul play, and they began building a case that Lori and Chad had conspired to kill Charles as well. The trials were long and complicated. Lori's trial began in April 2023. Prosecutors laid out a chilling timeline. Lori and Chad had identified people in their lives as zombies, possessed by dark spirits and beyond saving. Charles, Tammy, Tylee, and JJJ had all been labeled as such. The solution? Remove them. The prosecution presented text messages, financial records showing life insurance payouts, and testimony from friends who'd heard Lori's disturbing beliefs. The defense argued mental illness, religious delusion that Lori truly believed what she was doing was righteous. The jury deliberated and found Lori Vallow Daybell guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder for Tylee and JJ, and conspiracy to commit murder in Tammy's death. In July 2023, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell's trial followed in 2024. The evidence against him was just as damning. The bodies were found on his property. His DNA was discovered on items used to conceal them, and his financial motives were clear. In May 2024, he was convicted of first-degree murder for all 3 deaths: Tylee, JJ, and his own wife, Tammy. In June 2024, he was sentenced to death. Lori currently sits in an Idaho prison, and Chad is on death row, awaiting execution. Neither has shown genuine remorse. Lori continues to maintain her religious beliefs even from prison. And here's what keeps people awake. These were children. JJ was 7 years old. Tylee was 17. They trusted their mother, and she buried them in a backyard like they were obstacles, all in the name of religion, destiny, and life insurance money. How does a mother do that? Number 5, Ayub Majdullin. He was 14 years old. 14. Jaden Moody should have been worried about homework, friendships, maybe what game to play after school. Instead, on the evening of January the 8th, 2019, he was riding a moped through Leighton, East London, trying to navigate a world that had already chewed him up and spit him out. He'd been caught up in gang life, moved from Nottingham to London for his own safety, and was trying to survive in a city where post-Code Wars claimed young lives every week. That night, he didn't stand a chance. A black Mercedes pulled up alongside him, rammed him off his moped, and 3 men jumped out. Within seconds, Jaden was on the ground, and they stabbed him to death in the middle of the street. He was killed because of where he was from, what colors he might have represented, and the fact that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The person who delivered the fatal blows? Ayoub Majdoulin. He was 19 years old, a gang member with the Beaumont crew, and he'd been hunting that night. Not for Jaden specifically, he didn't even know the kid, but for anyone connected to a rival group. Jaden just happened to be the target they found. Ayoub Majdoulin grew up in East London, an area where gang violence had been escalating for years. Postcodes became territories, drill music videos turned into threats, and young men carried knives like they were part of the uniform. Majdoulin wasn't forced into this life. He chose it. He was part of the Beaumont crew, also known as the Beaumont Gang, a group involved in drug dealing, violence, and ongoing feuds with rival gangs across London. By the time he was 19, he already had a reputation. He was known to be impulsive, violent, and eager to prove himself. On January 8th, 2019, he got into a car with 2 other gang members, and they went looking for trouble. Jaden Moody was originally from Nottingham, but his family had moved him to London hoping to get him away from gang influences. It didn't work. London's gang culture pulled him in just as easily. He'd been involved in low-level activity, riding around on a moped, possibly running errands for older gang members. That evening, he was riding through Bickley Road in Leighton when the black Mercedes appeared. Witnesses later described what happened next as calculated and brutal. The Mercedes rammed into Jaden's moped, sending him flying onto the pavement. He didn't have time to run. 3 men jumped out of the car, and they surrounded him. Ayoub Majdoulin pulled out a knife and attacked. He stabbed Jaden multiple times. Witnesses reported seeing the attackers strike him again and again as he lay defenseless on the ground. The entire attack lasted less than a minute. When it was over, they got back in the car and drove off, leaving Jaden bleeding out on the street. Passers-by rushed to help. Someone called 999, and paramedics arrived within minutes. But Jaden was already gone. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A 14-year-old boy, lying in the street, killed over absolutely nothing. Imagine being a witness to that. Imagine seeing a child hunted down like that and knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. The investigation began immediately. The Metropolitan Police knew this was gang-related. The method, the location, the victim's background all pointed to it. CCTV footage from the area captured the black Mercedes before and after the attack. Traffic cameras tracked its movements across East London. Witnesses came forward, though many were terrified to speak. Gang violence carries an unspoken code. You don't talk to police, or you become the next target. But detectives pressed on. They identified the car, traced its ownership, and started building a picture of who was inside. Within days, they had names. Ayoub Majdoulin was one of them. His DNA was found on the knife that had been discarded near the scene. His phone records placed him in the area at the exact time of the attack. Surveillance footage showed him getting into the Mercedes earlier that evening. The evidence was piling up, but Majdoulin went on the run. For weeks, police hunted him across London. They raided addresses, followed leads, and appealed to the public for information. Finally, On January 22nd, 2 weeks after the attack, Magdalene was arrested in Islington. He'd been hiding out with associates, moving from place to place, but the net had closed in. He was charged with murder. The 2 other men in the car were also arrested and charged with related offenses, though Magdalene was identified as the one who'd actually stabbed Jaden. The trial began in November 2019 at the Old Bailey. Prosecutors presented the CCTV footage, the forensic evidence, the witness testimony. They argued that this was a premeditated gang attack, that Magdalene and his associates had gone out that night specifically to hurt or kill someone from a rival group, and that Jaden had simply been unlucky enough to cross their path. The defense tried to argue that Magdalene wasn't the main attacker, that he'd been in the car but hadn't delivered the fatal wounds, that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that his knife had been the one that killed Jaden. But the forensic evidence was too strong. His DNA was on the weapon. His behavior after the attack, fleeing, hiding, refusing to cooperate, showed consciousness of guilt. Witnesses identified him as one of the attackers. The jury wasn't swayed by the defense's arguments. In December 2019, Ayub Magdalene was found guilty of murder. The courtroom was filled with Jaden's family. His mother, Jada Bailey, had been vocal throughout the trial, demanding justice for her son and speaking out about the epidemic of knife crime in London. When the verdict was read, there were tears, but also a grim sense of relief. At least Magdalene would be held accountable. At least Jaden's life wouldn't be forgotten. Sentencing came shortly after. The judge described the attack as brutal and merciless, noting that Jaden had been utterly defenseless and that Magdalene had shown no remorse. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 21 years before he'd be eligible for parole. At 19 years old, that meant Magdalene wouldn't see freedom until he was at least 40, if he ever got out at all. The 2 other men involved received lesser sentences for their roles in the attack. Magdalene is currently serving his sentence in a UK prison. He's appealed the conviction, as many do, but so far nothing has changed. He remains behind bars, and Jaden Moody remains dead. Here's what haunts people about this case. Jaden was a child. He was 14 years old, and he was killed by people who didn't even know his name. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He wasn't a major gang figure. He was a kid who'd gotten swept up in a world that chews up young people and spits them out in body bags. And Ayub Magdalene? He threw his life away at 19 for what? Street credibility, reputation, a few seconds of violence that he can never take back? London sees cases like this too often. Young men with knives, postcode wars, drill music feuds that spill into real bloodshed. Jaden's mother has spent years campaigning against knife crime, trying to turn her grief into something that might save the next child. But the cycle keeps spinning. Somewhere in London right now, another teenager is carrying a knife. Another mother is terrified her son won't come home. And another life is about to be cut short for nothing. And that's the most senseless part of all. It was for absolutely nothing. Number 6. Sarah Barris and Brandon Machine. The call came in on the morning of May 24th, 2019. Emergency. Services rushed to a house on Gregg House Road in the Shire Green area of Sheffield, England. What they found inside was beyond comprehension. 4 children, unconscious, struggling to breathe. 2 more, 2 boys, aged 13 and 14, were already dead. The scene was chaotic, horrifying, and as paramedics worked frantically to save the surviving children, one question echoed through everyone's mind. What happened here? The answer, when it finally came out, was somehow even worse than anyone imagined. The children's own mother, Sarah Barris, and her partner, Brandon Machine, had tried to kill all 6 of them. And the reason? They were terrified the children would be taken into care. Sarah Barris was 35 years old, a mother of 6 children who ranged in age from 13 down to just a few years old. To neighbors, the family seemed troubled, but not outwardly dangerous. There were concerns. The house was often chaotic. The children sometimes seemed neglected, but nothing that screamed imminent danger. What people didn't know was the dark secret at the center of the family. Brandon Machine wasn't just Sarah's partner. He was her half-brother, and he was the father of all 6 children. Yes, you heard that right. Sarah Barras had been in an incestuous relationship with her own half-brother for years, and together they'd had 6 children. The relationship had been hidden from authorities, from social services, from most of the family. But by 2019, that secret was starting to unravel. Social services had begun asking questions. There were concerns about the children's welfare, their living conditions, their development. Sarah and Brandon became convinced that the children were going to be taken away, placed into care, and that their secret would be exposed. So they made a decision that defies all logic, all humanity, all basic parental instinct. They decided to kill the children rather than let them be taken. And they planned it. This wasn't a moment of madness, a sudden snap. They planned it over days, maybe weeks. They researched methods. They discussed it. They prepared. On May 23, 2019, the day before emergency services arrived, they began their attempt. They tried to poison the children with medication, crushing up tablets and putting them in drinks. When that didn't work fast enough, they tried something else. They attempted to drown them in the bathtub. When some of the children fought back, survived those attempts, Sarah and Barris moved to the final, most brutal method, suffocation. On the morning of May 24th, 2 of the boys, Tristan and Blake Barris, aged 13 and 14, were dead. 4 other children were barely clinging to life. It was Sarah herself who called 9999, claiming there had been an incident, that something terrible had happened. When paramedics and police arrived, they found a scene of absolute horror. The 2 boys were beyond saving. The other 4 children were rushed to hospital, and doctors worked desperately to stabilize them. They survived, but the trauma of what they'd endured, what their own mother and father had tried to do to them, would last forever. Imagine being one of those first responders. Imagine walking into a house where a mother has just tried to murder all 6 of her children. Sarah Barris and Brandon Machine were arrested immediately. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. The children who survived were able to give statements, age-appropriate, carefully managed interviews where they described what had happened. They talked about being given drinks that made them feel sick, about being held underwater, about their mother and Brandon trying to stop them from breathing. Forensic evidence backed up every word. The house was searched, and investigators found the medications that had been used, the remnants of the planning, the evidence of multiple attempts over multiple days. Both Sarah and Brandon were charged with 2 counts of murder for Tristan and Blake, and multiple counts of attempted murder for the 4 surviving children. They were also charged with conspiracy to commit murder because the evidence showed they'd been planning this together, working as a team to kill their own kids. The case shocked the nation. People struggled to understand how a mother could do this, how anyone could do this. The incestuous relationship added another layer of horror, but even that couldn't explain away what they'd done. The legal process moved forward, but there was no trial. In October 2019, both Sarah Barras and Brandon Machine pleaded guilty to all charges. They admitted to murdering Tristan and Blake. They admitted to attempting to murder the other 4 children. They admitted to conspiring together to wipe out their entire family. The guilty pleas spared the surviving children from having to testify in court, from having to relive the trauma in front of a jury. But it also meant the public never got the full story, never heard in detail what had driven them to this point. Sentencing came in November 2019 at Sheffield Crown Court. The judge's words were scathing. He described the crimes as evil and brutal, noting that Sarah and Brandon had put their own fears and desires above the lives of 6 innocent children. Victim impact statements were read on behalf of the surviving children and the extended family, describing the unimaginable pain, the loss, the lifelong trauma. Tristan and Blake were remembered as loving boys who'd had their entire futures stolen from them. Sarah Barris was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 35 years before she'd be eligible for parole. At 35 years old at the time of sentencing, that means she won't see freedom until she's 70, if ever. Brandon Machine received the same sentence, life with a minimum of 35 years. Both are currently serving their sentences in separate UK prisons. The 4 surviving children were placed into care, given new identities, and are being raised away from the horror of what happened to them. They're alive, but they'll carry the scars forever. Sarah Barris and Brandon Machine will likely never be released. The nature of their crimes, child murder, multiple attempted murders, the betrayal of the most fundamental bond between parent and child, means that even if they technically become eligible for parole decades from now, the parole board will almost certainly never let them out. Here's what's so deeply disturbing about this case. It was preventable. Social services had been involved with the family. There had been concerns, but the system failed to see just how dangerous things had become, failed to act quickly enough to protect those children. And Sarah and Brandon's reasoning, killing the children rather than losing them to care, is so twisted, so fundamentally broken, that it's almost impossible to comprehend. Most parents would do anything to protect their children. Sarah and Brandon did the opposite. They chose murder over separation, and 2 boys paid with their lives. Tristan and Blake Barris were 13 and 14 years old. They should have had decades ahead of them. School, careers, families of their own. Instead, they were suffocated in their own home by the people who were supposed to love them most. The 4 children who survived will grow up knowing their mother and father tried to kill them, that their brothers died, that their entire childhood was ripped away in one terrible week in May 2019. How do you ever recover from that? How do you ever trust anyone again? And how does a society let something like this happen in the first place? Those are the questions that linger, long after the headlines fade and the courtroom doors close. Because somewhere, right now, there's another family in crisis, another child at risk, and the systems meant to protect them are stretched too thin, moving too slowly, missing the warning signs. And the next, Sarah Barris might already be planning. Number 7, Ricardo Godinho. It was a quiet Friday afternoon in February 2019. Parents were doing the school run, picking up their children, going about their normal routines in the peaceful Surrey village of Woking. Alini Godinho was walking along Blakeney Road, heading to collect her 3 children from school like she did every day. She was excited. She had plans for the weekend. Things were looking up, and she was finally moving on with her life after a difficult divorce. She had no idea that her ex-husband, Ricardo Godinho, was waiting for her. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. He knew her route, knew her schedule, knew exactly when she'd be alone on that street, and at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, he struck. Within minutes, Alini was dead, and her children would grow up without their mother. Ricardo Godinho and Alini had been married, but the relationship had fallen apart. They'd divorced, and like many separated couples, there were tensions, arguments about custody, disagreements about how to raise the children, the usual painful aftermath of a broken marriage. But for Ricardo, 41 years old at the time, the separation had become an obsession. Friends and family would later say he'd never accepted it, never moved on, never let go of the belief that Alany somehow belonged to him. He'd made threats before, according to some reports. There had been concerning behavior, messages that made people uneasy, but nothing concrete enough to trigger serious alarm bells, nothing that made authorities step in. On February 8, 2019, that all changed. Alany was walking to the school, just a regular mom on a regular day. The street was quiet, but not empty. This was the school run after all, and other parents were around. Ricardo had been lying in wait. Some reports suggest he'd been parked nearby, watching, timing it perfectly. As Alany walked past, he approached her. There was no conversation, no warning, no chance to run. He attacked her with a knife, stabbing her multiple times in broad daylight on a residential street. Witnesses described hearing screams, seeing a man attacking a woman, and rushing to help. Some tried to intervene, shouting at him to stop, pulling out phones to call police. But Ricardo was focused, determined, and by the time anyone could physically reach them, the damage was done. Alany collapsed on the pavement. Ricardo fled on foot, disappearing into nearby streets before police could arrive. Paramedics were on the scene within minutes. This was a residential area. Emergency services were close, but Alany's injuries were catastrophic. She was rushed to St. George's Hospital in Tooting, but despite the best efforts of trauma surgeons, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. She was 38 years old. Her children, waiting at school, had no idea that their mother would never pick them up, that their lives had just changed forever. Imagine being one of those witnesses. Imagine seeing a woman attacked in the street, trying to help, and knowing you were just seconds too late. The manhunt began immediately. Police knew who they were looking for. Witnesses had seen Ricardo, some knew him from the neighborhood, and his identity was established quickly. A public appeal went out with his photo and description. He was considered armed and dangerous. Officers flooded the area, searching homes, checking CCTV, following every lead. The community was in shock. This was Woking, a quiet Surrey town where this kind of violence simply didn't happen. But it had happened, and Ricardo Godinho was on the run. He didn't get far. Within hours, police tracked him down to an address in the area. Armed officers surrounded the location, and Ricardo was arrested without incident. He didn't resist, didn't try to fight his way out. The knife was recovered, forensic evidence was gathered, and the case against him began to take shape. He was charged with murder and remanded in custody while the investigation continued. The investigation was straightforward in terms of evidence. There were multiple witnesses, CCTV footage of Ricardo in the area before and after the attack, forensic evidence linking him to the scene and the weapon itself. But investigators also had to piece together the why. They interviewed friends, family, looked through phone records and messages. What emerged was a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and control, someone who couldn't accept that his ex-wife had moved on, who'd been spiraling in the weeks leading up to the attack. Some people close to the situation later said they'd seen warning signs that Ricardo had been acting strangely, making comments that suggested he was fixated on Alany. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight. The trial took place months later at Guilford Crown Court. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. They showed the jury CCTV footage of Ricardo arriving in the area, waiting, then fleeing after the attack. They brought in witnesses who'd seen what happened, who'd heard Alany's screams, who'd tried to help. They presented forensic evidence linking Ricardo's DNA to the knife and to Alany's clothing. They argued this was a premeditated murder, that Ricardo had planned it, that he'd chosen the time and place deliberately, during the school run, when he knew exactly where Alany would be. The defense had little to work with. They couldn't argue Ricardo wasn't there. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they tried to suggest diminished responsibility, that Ricardo had been suffering from mental health issues, that he hadn't been in full control of his actions. Psychiatric experts were brought in, evaluations were conducted, but the prosecution countered that Ricardo had been functional enough to plan the attack, to wait for the right moment, to flee afterward. Those actions showed awareness, intent, and understanding of what he was doing. The jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict. Ricardo Godinho was convicted of murder. The courtroom heard victim impact statements from Alini's family, her parents, her siblings, her friends. They spoke about the woman she'd been, the mother she'd been, the future that had been stolen from her and her children. They talked about the 3 kids who would now grow up without their mom, who'd have to process the fact that their own father had killed her. The weight of that trauma would follow those children forever. Sentencing came shortly after. The judge described the crime as calculated and brutal, noting that Ricardo had shown no remorse, had offered no real explanation beyond his inability to accept the end of the marriage. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 27 years before he'd be eligible for parole. At 41 years old at the time of sentencing, that meant Ricardo wouldn't even be considered for release until he was 68. And given the nature of the crime, parole is far from guaranteed. Ricardo Godinho is currently serving his sentence in a UK prison. He's appealed certain aspects of his case, as many convicted criminals do, but the conviction stands. He remains behind bars, and Alini remains gone. Here's what's so chilling about this case. It happened in the middle of the day, on a street full of parents doing the school run, in a safe, quiet neighborhood. Alini wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She wasn't living a high-risk lifestyle. She was just a mom trying to pick up her kids. And Ricardo killed her because he couldn't accept that she'd moved on, that she had a life without him. It's a story that plays out too often. Domestic violence that escalates, controlling behavior that turns lethal, warning signs that get missed or dismissed until it's too late. And 3 children are left without a mother. They'll grow up knowing their father murdered her, that he chose violence over letting her go. How do you process that as a child? How do you ever feel safe again? Those are the questions that don't have good answers, the scars that don't heal with time. Alini Godinho should still be alive. She should be watching her children grow up, celebrating birthdays, living her life. Instead, she's gone, and Ricardo Godinho sits in a prison cell, a life wasted, a family destroyed, all because one man couldn't handle rejection. Number 8. Benjamin Topping. She was 27 years old and loved by everyone who knew her. Rosie Derbyshire was funny, kind, full of life, the type of person who lit up every room she walked into. She had dreams, plans, a whole future ahead of her. But on February 20th, 2019, in the town of Preston, Lancashire, that future was taken from her in the most brutal way imaginable. Her boyfriend, Benjamin Topping, beat her to death with a crowbar. He hit her so many times with such force that when police finally found her body, she was unrecognizable. Her own family couldn't identify her by looking at her face. And the reason? Topping later claimed he'd just snapped. But the evidence told a different story, one of control, rage, and violence that had been building for far longer than one terrible night. Benjamin Topping was 30 years old, and from the outside, he seemed like an ordinary guy. He worked, had friends, lived a relatively normal life in Preston. But those closest to the relationship knew there were problems. Rosie and Benjamin had been together for a while, and like many abusive relationships, it had started off fine before slowly deteriorating. There were arguments, controlling behavior, moments of aggression that Rosie had confided to friends about. She'd talked about leaving, about getting out, but like so many people trapped in toxic relationships, she kept hoping things would get better. They didn't. February 20th, 2019 started like any other day. Rosie was at the home she shared with Benjamin in Preston. Exactly what triggered the attack remains unclear. Topping gave various accounts, none of them fully coherent. But what is clear is that at some point that day, he snapped. He grabbed a crowbar, a heavy metal tool designed for demolition, and he attacked Rosie. He struck her over and over and over again. The pathologist, who later examined her body, counted more than 30 separate injuries. Her skull was fractured multiple times. Her face was destroyed. The attack was so savage, so prolonged, that it's impossible to imagine the terror Rosie must have felt in those final moments. And then Topping left her there. He didn't call for help. He didn't try to explain himself. He simply walked away, leaving Rosie's body in the house, and went about his business as if nothing had happened. It took 2 days for anyone to find her. Friends and family became worried when Rosie didn't answer calls or messages. She was always in touch, always. Responsive. And the silence was alarming. On February 22nd, someone went to the house to check on her. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. Rosie's body was lying there, surrounded by blood, her injuries so severe that she was barely recognizable as the vibrant young woman she'd been just days before. Emergency services were called immediately, but there was nothing anyone could do. Rosie had been dead for at least a day, possibly longer. Imagine being the person who found her. Imagine walking into that house and seeing what Benjamin Topping had done. The investigation moved quickly. Police knew they were looking for Benjamin Topping. He was Rosie's boyfriend. He lived in the house, and he was nowhere to be found. A manhunt was launched. His photo was circulated, appeals went out to the public, and officers searched across Preston and the surrounding areas. Topping had fled, but he hadn't gone far. He was located within 24 hours, hiding out at an address nearby. When police arrested him, he didn't resist. He was taken into custody, and the questioning began. Topping's story changed multiple times. At first, he claimed he didn't know what happened, that he'd left the house and Rosie had been fine. Then he admitted there'd been an argument. Eventually, under the weight of the forensic evidence, he admitted to the attack but tried to claim it was a moment of madness, that he'd lost control, that he hadn't meant to kill her. But the forensic evidence painted a very different picture. The number of blows, the sustained nature of the attack, the severity of Rosie's injuries. This wasn't a brief moment of rage. This was prolonged, deliberate violence. The crowbar was recovered, covered in blood and forensic material that linked it directly to the scene and to Topping. Benjamin Topping was charged with murder. The case went to trial at Preston Crown Court in late 2019. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the pathologist's findings, photos of the scene. Though those were shown only to the jury, too horrific for public release. They brought in friends and family who testified about the relationship, about the warning signs, about Rosie's fears in the weeks leading up to her death. They argued that Topping had been controlling, that the violence had been escalating, and that February 20th was simply the night it reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, suggesting Topping had mental health issues, that he'd been under stress, that he genuinely hadn't meant to kill Rosie. They brought in psychiatric evaluations, tried to paint him as someone who'd lost control rather than someone who'd deliberately taken a life. But the evidence was too strong. You don't hit someone 30 times with a crowbar by accident. You don't fracture someone's skull multiple times in a moment of brief rage. The jury saw through the defense's arguments. After deliberation, Benjamin Topping was found guilty of murder. The verdict came with a sense of grim relief for Rosie's family, who'd sat through weeks of testimony, through hearing the details of what had been done to their daughter, their sister, their friend. Victim impact statements were read at sentencing, and they were heartbreaking. Rosie's mother spoke about the daughter she'd lost, about how Rosie had been planning to leave the relationship, about how she'd been so close to getting out. Friends talked about the vibrant, loving person Rosie had been and how the world was darker without her in it. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. He described the attack as ferocious and sustained, noting that Rosie had been beaten beyond recognition, that she'd suffered unimaginable pain and terror in her final moments, and that Benjamin Topping had shown no genuine remorse. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years before he'd be eligible for parole. At 30 years, old at the time of sentencing, that meant Topping wouldn't see freedom until he was at least 50. And given the brutality of the crime, parole is far from certain. Benjamin Topping is currently serving his sentence in a UK prison. He's maintained various excuses and justifications over the years, but the conviction stands. He remains behind bars, and Rosie Darbyshire remains gone, beaten to death by someone who claimed to love her. Here's what haunts people about this case. The warning signs were there. Friends knew the relationship was troubled. Rosie had talked about leaving. But like so many victims of domestic violence, she stayed just a little too long, gave him just one more chance, hoped things would change. And it cost her everything. Domestic violence doesn't always look like the stereotype. It escalates slowly, hides behind closed doors, and by the time people realize how dangerous things have become, it's often too late. Rosie Darbyshire was 27 years old. She should have had decades ahead of her, a career, maybe marriage and children of her own, travel, laughter, life. Instead, she's buried, and her family is left with nothing but memories and the knowledge that Benjamin Topping stole her future with a crowbar. He took one of the most vibrant, loving people in their lives and beat her until she was unrecognizable. That's not a moment of madness. That's murder, pure and simple. And somewhere right now, there's another Rosie, another woman trapped in a relationship that's getting more dangerous by the day, wondering if she should leave, if it's really that bad, if things might get better. The answer is always the same. Leave. Get out. Ask for help. Because staying might mean becoming the next headline, the next case, the next life cut short by someone who claimed to love you. Rosie Darbyshire deserved better. She deserved to live. Number 9, Kenyal Brown, Detroit, Michigan. A city that's seen more than its share of violence, poverty, and struggle. But even in a place hardened by decades of hardship, what happened between 2019 and 2020 stood out. 6 people, 6 separate individuals going about their lives, were robbed and murdered in Wayne County. They weren't connected to each other, didn't know each other, had no common thread except for one. They all crossed paths with Kenyal Brown. He became known as the Metro Detroit serial killer, a man who hunted victims for their money, their belongings, whatever he could take. And when he was done, he killed them. No hesitation, no remorse. Just cold, calculated murder. By the time police finally identified him, Brown had decided he wouldn't face justice. On March 31st, 2020, before authorities could arrest him, he took his own life. Kenyal Brown wasn't on anyone's radar initially. He wasn't a known violent offender with a long criminal history that screamed future serial killer. But somewhere along the line, whether it was desperation, greed, or something darker, he started targeting people. The pattern was consistent. He'd approach victims under some pretense, rob them, and then kill them to eliminate witnesses. The murders spanned from 2019 into early 2020, and they happened across Wayne County, making it difficult for investigators to immediately connect them as the work of one person. The victims were everyday people. Some were walking alone at night. Others were in vulnerable situations, maybe getting into their cars, maybe in areas where they felt safe but weren't. Brown didn't discriminate based on age, gender, or background. What mattered to him was opportunity. Could he get close? Could he take what he wanted? And could he silence them permanently? The answer, 6 times, was yes. Each murder was brutal in its efficiency. Brown wasn't interested in torturing people or making some twisted statement. He wanted money, valuables, whatever he could sell or use, and he was willing to kill to get it. Imagine living in Detroit during this time, hearing about these seemingly random murders, wondering if you could be next. Imagine the fear rippling through communities as word spread that someone was out there, hunting. The first few murders didn't immediately register as connected. Detroit has a high crime rate, and sadly, homicides aren't uncommon. But as the body count grew, detectives started noticing patterns. The method of killing was similar. The locations, while spread out, formed a geographic cluster. Witness descriptions, though vague, started pointing toward a single suspect. Surveillance footage from various scenes captured glimpses of a man. Same build, same general appearance. Phone records and forensic evidence began tying the murders together. By early 2020, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The task force assembled, pooling resources from multiple agencies. They analyzed every shred of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, combed through security footage frame by frame. Slowly, a picture emerged. They identified a suspect, Kenyel Brown. His name came up through a combination of forensic evidence, witness identifications, and digital footprints. He'd been sloppy in some ways, using victims' credit cards, selling stolen items that could be traced, being in the wrong place at the wrong time when cameras were rolling. The net was closing in. Brown knew it. Whether through word on the street, paranoia, or seeing police activity increase around him, he realized his time was running out. On March 31st, 2020, as authorities were preparing to move in and make the arrest, Kenyel Brown made his final decision. He took his own life. The exact circumstances vary depending on the source, but the outcome was the same. He was found dead, and the case against him would never see a courtroom. For investigators, it was a frustrating conclusion. They'd done the work, built the case, identified the killer, but there would be no trial, no conviction, no public accounting of what he'd done. For the families of the 6 victims, it was even worse. They'd never get to see Brown face justice. They'd never hear him explain why, never get closure from a guilty verdict, never watch him be sentenced and taken away. He'd escaped accountability in the most permanent way possible. The investigation didn't end with Brown's death, though. Detectives had to confirm, beyond any doubt, that he was responsible for all 6 murders. They went back through the evidence, matched forensic findings, verified timelines. They interviewed people who'd known Brown, looking for any accomplices. The case mentioned 9 accomplices in some reports, individuals who may have been involved in various capacities, helping with robberies, disposing of evidence, providing alibis. Some of these individuals were charged with related crimes, though the details remain murky. The focus had always been on Brown as the primary perpetrator, the one who'd actually committed the murders. As investigators dug deeper, they began to suspect Brown's involvement went beyond the 6 confirmed murders. There were unsolved cases in the area with similar characteristics. Some reports suggest he may have been responsible for anywhere from 4 to 26 additional murders. The wide range reflects the uncertainty. Without Brown alive to question, without concrete forensic links, it's impossible to know for sure. Some cases remain open, listed as possibly connected but never definitively proven. Families of those victims are left in limbo, wondering if their loved one was another of Brown's victims or if the killer is still out there. The 6 confirmed victims, their names, their stories, deserve to be remembered. Each one was a life cut short, a family left grieving, a future stolen. They weren't just statistics or entries in a police file. They were people with jobs, families, friends, dreams, and Kenyon Brown took all of that away for what? Money? A robbery? The ultimate motive remains unclear because Brown never explained himself, never faced questioning, never had to answer for what he'd done. Wayne County, and Detroit specifically, has tried to move forward. The case closed with Brown's death, though the investigation into potential accomplices and additional victims continues in some capacity. But for the families, there's no moving forward. Not really. 6 families, possibly more, are left without answers, without justice, without the closure that comes from seeing a killer held accountable. Here's what makes this case so deeply unsatisfying. Kenyon Brown got away with it. Yes, he's dead. Yes, he can't hurt anyone else. But he chose the timing and manner of his exit. He denied his victims' families the chance to face him in court, to hear a jury say guilty, to watch him be sentenced and led away in handcuffs. He took that from them just like he took everything else. And that's the cruelest part of all. Even in death, he maintained control. Serial killers, like Brown, often operate in the margins, targeting vulnerable people in communities where violence is already high, where murders might not immediately trigger the intense investigation they deserve. It's a grim reality that allows some killers to rack up multiple victims before anyone realizes what's happening. By the time Detroit police connected the dots, 6 people were already dead, and possibly many more. And now Kenyon Brown is gone, taking his secrets with him. Somewhere in Detroit, there are families who still don't know if their loved one's unsolved murder was his doing. There are cold cases sitting in filing cabinets that might be connected but can't be proven. There's a community that had to live in fear while he was active, and now has to live with the knowledge that they'll never fully understand the scope of what he did. That's the legacy of Kenyon Brown. Not justice served, not a trial that brought truth to light, but a void. A series of murders, a string of victims, and a killer who chose death over accountability, and 6 families, at minimum, who'll never get the closure they deserve. Number 10. Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez. El Salvador is no stranger to violence. For decades, the small Central American nation has been plagued by gang warfare, poverty, and a murder rate that's consistently ranked among the highest in the world. But even in a country hardened by brutality, what Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez did stood out. Between the late 2000s and early 2010s, he and 9 accomplices terrorized communities across El Salvador, targeting women and girls in the most horrific ways imaginable. They didn't just kill, they assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 14 confirmed victims, with investigators suspecting the true number could be anywhere from 18 to 40. And when authorities finally caught him, the evidence was so overwhelming, the crime so heinous, that even El Salvador's overburdened justice system had no choice but to lock him away for 70 years. Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez wasn't acting alone, and that's part of what made this case so disturbing. He had 9 accomplices, men who participated in the attacks, helped identify victims, assisted in disposing of bodies, and maintained the network of violence that allowed these crimes to continue for years. They operated like a predatory gang, targeting vulnerable women and girls in areas where police presence was minimal and where victims' families often lacked the resources or connections to push for justice. In El Salvador, where organized crime dominates entire neighborhoods and authorities are stretched impossibly thin, these men found a deadly opportunity. The confirmed victims numbered 14. 14 women and girls whose lives were stolen in acts of unimaginable violence. The pattern was consistent and calculated. Victims were assaulted before being killed. Some were abducted off the streets, others were lured under false pretenses, and some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The attacks happened across multiple regions of El Salvador, making it difficult initially for investigators to connect them as the work of a single group. Bodies were found in remote areas, disposed of in ways meant to delay identification and hinder investigation. Imagine being a woman in these communities during this time, knowing that other women were disappearing, knowing that the police were overwhelmed and under-resourced, wondering if you'd be next. But 14 was just the confirmed number. As investigators dug deeper, as they interviewed witnesses and analyzed patterns, suspicions grew that Chavez and his accomplices were responsible for far more. Reports suggest anywhere from 4 to 26 additional murders could be linked to the group. The wide range reflects the challenges of investigating crimes in El Salvador: bodies that go unidentified, cases that go unreported, families too afraid or too poor to push for answers. Some victims may have been migrants, people passing through who had no one to report them missing. Others may have been from communities where distrust of police runs so deep that families never came forward. The investigation into Chavez and his network took years. El Salvador's police and judicial system are chronically underfunded, dealing with gang violence and a murder rate that means homicide detectives are juggling dozens of active cases at any given time. But as the body count grew, as patterns emerged, resources were allocated. A task force was formed, combining local police with national investigators. They started connecting the dots: similar methods of killing, overlapping geographic areas, witness descriptions that matched, forensic evidence that tied different crime scenes together. Forensic evidence became crucial. DNA analysis, though limited by El Salvador's resources, helped link multiple crime scenes to the same perpetrators. Witnesses began coming forward, some after years of silence, emboldened by the knowledge that police were taking the case seriously. Some of the accomplices were arrested first, and under interrogation, they began to talk. They gave up names, described the hierarchy within the group, detailed how victims were selected and attacked. Slowly, the case against Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez solidified. Chavez was arrested after a coordinated operation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. The arrest was kept quiet initially. In El Salvador, where gang retaliation is a real threat, authorities often move carefully when dealing with organized criminal networks. Once in custody, Chavez was presented with the evidence against him. Witnesses identified him, accomplices testified. Forensic evidence placed him at multiple crime scenes. The case was overwhelming. The trial, when it finally happened, was a major event in El Salvador's judicial system. The prosecution presented evidence of 14 confirmed murders, walking the court through each victim, each crime scene, each piece of evidence that tied Chavez and his accomplices to the attacks. They brought in forensic experts, showed DNA evidence, presented witness testimony. The families of the victims, those who could be identified, sat in the courtroom, many of them seeing Chavez for the first time, confronting the man who destroyed their lives. The defense had little to work with. They couldn't dispute the forensic evidence, couldn't explain away the witness testimony, couldn't provide alibis for the times and locations of the murders. Some attempts were made to shift blame onto the accomplices, to suggest Chavez had been less involved than prosecutors claimed, but the evidence showed he was central to the operation. He'd been a leader, an active participant, someone who'd committed these crimes directly and repeatedly. The verdict came after weeks of testimony. Guilty. Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez was convicted of 14 counts of murder, along with numerous other charges related to the attacks. The courtroom erupted, families crying, some in relief, others in continued anguish because no guilty verdict could bring back their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. The judge moved to sentencing, and given the severity and number of the crimes, handed down a sentence of 70 years in prison. 70 years. In El Salvador, where life expectancy is lower and prison conditions are notoriously harsh, that's effectively a life sentence. Chavez, regardless of his age at conviction, will almost certainly die in prison. There's no parole system that would see him released. The 9 accomplices received various sentences as well, though details on their individual punishments remain less publicized. Some testified against Chavez in exchange for reduced sentences. Others fought the charges and received lengthy prison terms of their own. Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez is currently serving his 70-year sentence in one of El Salvador's maximum security prisons. Conditions in these facilities are brutal. Overcrowding, gang violence, even inside the walls, minimal medical care. For someone convicted of crimes against women in a culture where even hardened criminals have codes, Chavez's time behind bars is likely particularly dangerous. But he's alive, which is more than can be said for his 14 confirmed victims. Here's what haunts investigators about this case: the suspected additional victims. Somewhere between 4 and 26 more women and girls may have fallen victim to Chavez and his accomplices. Their families may never know what happened to them. Their bodies may never be found. Their cases may remain open forever, cold files in an overwhelmed system. And that's the tragedy within the tragedy. Not only were these women killed, but some of them were erased so completely that they can't even be counted among the confirmed victims. El Salvador has tried to reform its approach to violence against women in recent years, implementing specialized units to investigate these crimes, trying to create systems where victims and their families feel safe coming forward. But the challenges are immense. In a country where gang violence claims thousands of lives annually, where police are outgunned and under-resourced, cases like Chavez's can slip through the cracks until the body count becomes impossible to ignore. And here's the question that lingers. How many more are out there? How many other Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavezes are operating right now in El Salvador, in Central America, in regions where poverty and violence create the perfect conditions for predators to thrive? How many women and girls will disappear before someone notices the pattern, before resources are allocated, before justice catches up? For the families of the 14 confirmed victims, there's some measure of closure. At least they know what happened. At least the person responsible is behind bars. But for those other families, the ones whose loved ones might have been victims 18 through 40, there's only uncertainty, only questions that may never be answered, only the knowledge that somewhere, someone they loved disappeared, and they'll never know if Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez was the reason why. 70 years in prison, justice served in the technical sense, but 14 lives lost at minimum, possibly 40, and no sentence, no amount of prison time can ever balance that scale.